After last class, Beezie had a question about the self as object versus the self as subject, and so he thought it would be a really good idea if we went through the actual thing that Kant calls the paralogism, so the main problematic syllogism. Okay, so Beezie, hi buddy. We're gonna discuss it right here. Beezie's right there, so don't worry. Okay, so we've got these three lines, and I've paraphrased it a little bit. So we've got what can only be thought as subject, can only exist as subject, and so it's substance. And so that substance bit is going to be pretty important, especially for those dualists. Second line, a thinking being as such. So a thinking being considered as a thinking being can only be thought as subject. And then the conclusion, therefore, it only exists as substance. And he means that to basically capture what's going on with a lot of the arguments in rational psychology. So the first idea has to do with the idea of the soul, so things which can only be thought of as subjects. Okay, so the things which can only be thought of as subjects, those might be the substances. Okay, and the second one is what we get from the I think. So we can only think of a thinking being as a thinking subject. Okay, and so from there, some of the rational psychologists will try to conclude that therefore we, as thinking beings, only exist as substance. Now, what Kant is saying is wrong with this is he's saying that we are equivocating. Okay, so he thinks that there's an equivocation going on because, there's an equivocation problem. Okay, so the idea about what can only be thought up here, and then a thinking being as such down here. Okay, so these two in the argument are supposed to refer to the same things, but Kant thinks that in the first case, this idea of what can only be thought must be a substance. Okay, what can only be thought as subject must be a substance. He thinks that that is the idea of kind of the soul as object. Okay, so if we're thinking about our souls, okay, as substances, we're thinking about our souls as objects, or ourselves as objects, okay, or our minds as objects. Okay, whereas when we're actually doing something, inferring from a thinking being as such, then we're talking about ourself as subjects. So of course we can't help but think of ourselves as thinking beings, but that just means that as subjects, so as those who are thinking, we can only experience ourselves as thinking beings. Okay, so we can only be thought of as subjects from the perspective of being that thinking person, being that thinking entity. Okay. So the error there is going from the thinking being as such, okay, so insofar as we experience ourselves, to a thinking being as an actual object out there in the world. So that's why it's an equivocation. It's because the same kind of term, so he says it's thinking, is getting discussed in two different ways. And so that's what's going on with this particular syllogism. So it's actually a logical fallacy in some ways, insofar as equivocation is a logical fallacy.